The study still smelled like him, that distinctive mixture of pipe tobacco, old leather, and something else, something I could never quite identify. Outside, snow was falling heavily, coating the windows of his Victorian home in a thick white blanket that muffled all sound from the world beyond. It was December 2023, just 3 weeks after we laid him to rest, and I had finally gathered the courage to begin clearing out his belongings. I remember standing there, surrounded by towering bookshelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, each one packed with leather-bound volumes and weathered journals. My grandfather had been a collector of stories, of secrets, but there was one story that haunted him more than any other, one that he would only speak of during the darkest winter nights, when the wind howled like a wounded animal and the shadows seemed to crawl across the walls of his study. The Dyatlov Pass Incident. Even now, as I run my fingers along the spines of his books, I can hear his voice, that deep, gravelly Russian accent that never quite faded despite decades in America. He would lean forward in his worn leather armchair, pipe smoke curling around him like a protective shroud, and his eyes would take on that distant look. Before beginning any tale about the pass, he would methodically check every window, every door, drawing the heavy velvet curtains tight against the night. At the time, I thought it was just for dramatic effect, another of his storytelling quirks that I'd grown to love throughout my childhood. I know better now. The funeral had been a small affair, held on a bitter cold day that reminded me of his stories. As I watched them lower his casket into the frozen ground, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the tree line. Perhaps that's what finally drove me to start the task of cleaning out his study, that gnawing sensation that there was something he needed me to find. I wasn't wrong. It was the 13th box of books I'd packed when I noticed it, a slight hollow sound in the wooden paneling behind one of the shelves. My grandfather had always been paranoid about hiding things, but this was different. The craftsmanship of the hidden compartment was exquisite, its edges so perfectly fitted that it had remained undetected for decades. Inside was a wooden box, its surface carved with Cyrillic inscriptions that seemed to shift in the dim light of the study. My hands trembled as I lifted it out. The box was heavier than it looked, and something inside shifted with a metallic scrape that sent a shiver down my spine. The brass clasp was cold under my fingers, unnaturally cold, and for a moment, I hesitated. In all his stories, my grandfather had warned about the price of knowing too much, about doors that couldn't be closed once opened. But I had to know. The lid creaked open, revealing layers of yellowed newspaper clippings, photographs curled with age, and beneath them all, a leather-bound journal that seemed to pulse with its own gravity. But it was the object wrapped in faded red cloth that drew my attention first. A metal pendant, covered in symbols that hurt my eyes if I looked at them too long. The first photograph showed a group of young hikers, their faces bright with excitement and determination. 9 souls who had no idea they were walking into their doom. I recognized Igor Dyatlov immediately from my grandfather's descriptions. The confident set of his jaw, the intelligent gleam in his eyes. They were standing at the base of a mountain, their breath visible in the cold air, equipment packed and ready for their journey. Had they felt it, I wondered, thumbing through the other photographs? Had they sensed the wrongness of that place, or had it crept up on them slowly, like frost spreading across a window pane? The final photograph in the stack made my blood run cold. It showed the same mountain, but in this image, there was something else. A darkness between the trees that couldn't be explained by shadows, and in that darkness, what looked like eyes reflecting the camera's flash. With trembling hands, I opened the journal. My grandfather's handwriting filled the pages, cramped and urgent, as if he had been racing against time itself to record what he knew. The first entry was dated February 1959, just days after the hikers had gone missing. My grandfather had been different then, young, ambitious, a junior investigator with the Soviet government who thought he understood how the world worked. The Dyatlov Pass Incident would change all of that forever. As I began to read, the snow outside grew heavier and the wind picked up its mournful howl, but I barely noticed. I was lost in my grandfather's words, in the terrible truth he had carried for all these years, a truth that now, for better or worse, would become my burden to bear. And somewhere in the gathering darkness outside the study windows, something stirred, awake and aware that another keeper of secrets had begun their journey into the mysteries of Dyatlov Pass. The first pages of my grandfather's journal were filled with official investigation notes, written in a steady hand that would grow increasingly erratic as the entries progressed. I settled deeper into his old leather chair and began to read. February 26, 1959. The initial search party returned today with news that chills me to my core. They found the hiker's tent on the slope of Dead Mountain, ripped open from the inside. Their belongings were still there: food, warm clothes, boots, all abandoned as if they had fled in terror from some unseen threat. The snow around the tent told a strange story. 9 sets of footprints, some barefoot, others in socks or a single shoe, leading down the mountain through deep snow and temperatures that would kill an exposed human in minutes. What could make 9 experienced hikers flee into certain death? The first 5 bodies were found scattered through the forest below. Doroshenko and Krivonashenko were discovered beneath an old cedar tree, barefoot and dressed only in underclothes. Their hands were burned raw from attempting to start a fire, and nearby branches were broken as high as 5 meters up the tree, as if they had desperately tried to climb it, to escape something on the ground. When they brought in Dyatlov's body, I noticed something odd about his watch. It had stopped at 8:14, but the glass was intact, the mechanism undamaged. The team's other watches showed different times, all frozen, all undamaged. Local Mansi guides who helped with the search refused to approach the bodies. One of them, an elderly man named Victor, pulled me aside and spoke in hushed tones about the mountain's history. "This place," he said, his weathered face grave. "It does not belong to us. There are things here older than time, older than the stones themselves. Your hikers, they crossed a boundary that should not be crossed." I dismissed his warnings as superstition. We were modern Soviets, men of science and reason. But as I write these words, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me through my office window, even though I'm on the 4th floor. March 4th, 1959. Today we found Dubinina and Zolotaryov's bodies in a ravine buried under 4 meters of snow. The coroner's report made no sense. Their injuries suggested they had been subjected to an enormous pressure comparable to a car crash, yet there was no external trauma. Dubinina's tongue was missing, her eyes gone, but there were no signs of animal predation. The most disturbing discovery was the radiation. Their clothes registered levels far higher than normal background radiation, yet there were no known sources of radiation in the area. When I attempted to document these findings in my official report, my superior ordered me to remove any mention of radiation. His hands shook as he gave the order, and I noticed dark circles under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept in days. That night, as I was leaving the morgue, I saw something that still haunts my dreams. In the reflection of a window, for just a moment, I saw figures standing behind the bodies, tall, impossible figures that seemed to absorb the light around them. When I turned, there was nothing there, but the air had grown so cold that frost had formed on the inside of the windows. March 15th, 1959. I've begun conducting my own investigation, separate from the official one. The locals are terrified, but a few have opened up to me after I shared a bottle of vodka and promised to protect their identities. They spoke of ancient burial grounds on the mountain, of rituals performed by their ancestors to keep something contained. One old woman told me about a ceremony that used to be performed every winter solstice until the Soviets banned religious practices. Without the ceremony, she whispered, the gates grow weak. What gates? I asked. She wouldn't answer directly, but she gave me a pendant. The same one I've wrapped in red cloth and hidden with these notes. She said it would offer some protection, but warned me never to look at it for too long. I understand why now. The symbols seem to move when you're not looking directly at them, forming patterns that make my head spin if I try to follow them. I've noticed other strange things since I began looking deeper into the case. My office grows unnaturally cold at random times. Documents go missing, only to reappear days later with certain words blacked out. Last night, my phone rang at 3 in the morning. When I answered, I heard what sounded like 9 voices speaking in unison in a language I've never heard before. The line went dead after exactly 9 seconds. March 20th, 1959. I found something today. Following the old woman's clues about burial grounds, I discovered records of an abandoned mining operation in the area from the 1930s. The mine was suddenly closed and sealed without explanation. What caught my attention were the reports filed just before the closure. Accounts of workers going missing, of strange sounds echoing through the tunnels, of men driven mad by something they claimed to have seen in the deepest shafts. The mining operation's location matches perfectly with the symbols carved into ancient stones I found scattered throughout the area. These stones form a pattern, not a circle as you might expect, but something more complex, a shape that seems to change depending on where you stand. The locals call it the boundary. I managed to track down one of the surviving miners, now living in a remote cabin far from the mountains. His hands wouldn't stop shaking as he told me about the day they broke through into what they thought was a natural cave system. "We found things down there," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Things that couldn't exist. Machines that weren't machines. Writings that moved. And the voices. Always the voices." He took his own life that night. The official report cited alcohol poisoning. April 2nd, 1959. "They're following me now. Men in dark coats who stand too still to be human. I see them in crowds, in reflections, always watching. My photographs of the investigation are developing strangely. Dark figures appearing in the background, growing clearer with each new roll of film." I visited the site again yesterday. The snow had melted enough to reveal something the initial search missed. A concrete structure, old but not ancient, hidden beneath decades of growth. The entrance was sealed with heavy steel doors bearing both Soviet military markings and those same ancient symbols I'd seen on the stones. Inside, I found evidence of experiments. The documents were heavily deteriorated, but I could make out enough to understand that the Soviets hadn't started something here. They'd found it. Something older, something they thought they could control. I took samples from the facility's walls. The radiation readings were off the charts. April 15th, 1959. What I'm about to write will sound impossible, but I swear on my soul, it's true. I found one of the missing hikers' cameras in the facility, overlooked by the original investigation. The film was mostly destroyed by radiation, but one image remained clear enough to process. It shows the group huddled together at night, their faces masks of terror. Behind them, illuminated by their flashlights, stands a door that shouldn't exist. A doorway made of light, or perhaps darkness so complete it glowed. And emerging from that door, I won't describe what I saw, I can't, but I understand now why they ran into the freezing night, why they would choose certain death over what was coming for them. The more I uncover, the more I realize this goes beyond the 9 hikers. The Dyatlov Pass Incident was just one manifestation of something that's been happening in these mountains for centuries. The Mansi people knew, the Soviets knew, and now I know too. But knowledge has a price. As I write these words, the temperature in my room is dropping rapidly. Frost is forming on my pen. The symbols on the pendant are glowing, casting shadows that move against the laws of light. And outside my window, standing in the street below, I can see a figure in a military uniform that went out of use decades ago. It's looking up at me with a face I recognize from the hikers' photographs. It's Igor Dyatlov. He's smiling. I had to stop reading for a moment. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold the journal, and the temperature in the study had dropped so low that I could see my breath hanging in the air. The next several pages were blank, as if my grandfather had been too terrified to continue writing. When his entries resumed, the handwriting had changed, more frantic, almost desperate. May 1st, 1959. I ran. God help me, I ran as far as I could. But it doesn't matter. They follow me everywhere. The hikers, I see them all now. In crowds, in mirrors, in the moment between awake and sleeping. Their faces are always the same, frozen in that terrible smile. The pendant grows colder every day. Sometimes I catch it pulsing with a light that has no source, casting those impossible shadows. I tried to destroy it once. The metal won't break, won't melt, won't even scratch. The old woman was right. It offers protection, but it's also a beacon. They know where I am. They always know. I'm writing this from a monastery in the Carpathian Mountains. The monks here have their own stories about doors that shouldn't exist and things that wait behind them. They speak of guardians, people chosen to keep the knowledge of these places, to prevent others from repeating past mistakes. I think I understand now why I was chosen to find what I found. Someone has to remember, someone has to know the truth. The journal entries grew more sporadic after that, spanning years, then decades. I read about my grandfather's flight to America, his constant moves from city to city, always staying one step ahead of something he never fully described. He wrote about the others he met, other guardians, other keepers of terrible truths. Some entries were written in code, others in languages I didn't recognize. But it was the final entry, dated just 1 week before his death, that made my blood freeze in my veins. December 1st, 2023. My dearest grandchild. If you're reading this, then everything has happened as it must. The pendant will have called to you. The knowledge will have found its next guardian. I'm sorry, more sorry than you can imagine. But this is how it has to be. The burden passes from generation to generation. The door must be watched. The truth must be preserved. They're getting stronger. The rituals that kept them contained are being forgotten. The old boundaries are failing. What happened to those 9 hikers in 1959 was just the beginning. They're going to try again, and soon. Look for the signs. Unexplained disappearances in the mountains, strange lights in the sky, people who smile too widely and stand too still. They're already here, walking among us, wearing faces they've borrowed from the dead. There's a safe deposit box at the First National Bank downtown. The key is hidden behind the loose brick in the study's fireplace. Inside the box, you'll find everything you need to continue my work. Coordinates, contact information for other guardians, and most importantly, the true map of the boundaries. Don't trust what you see in mirrors. Don't answer the phone at night. And whatever you do, don't let them know you can see them. They're watching me write this now, standing in the corner of my room, wearing the faces of those poor hikers. But it doesn't matter anymore. My part in this story is ending. Yours is just beginning. I'm sorry. With all my love, your grandfather. P.S. If you see Igor Dyatlov smiling at you, run. I lowered the journal with trembling hands. The study had grown so cold that ice crystals were forming on the windows. As I sat there, trying to process everything I'd read, a movement caught my eye, a reflection in the darkened window, a figure standing behind my chair. I spun around, but the study was empty. When I turned back to the window, the figure was still there in the reflection, wearing a Soviet-era hiking uniform. Slowly, impossibly, it began to smile. The pendant in my hand pulsed once, its symbols glowing with that same otherworldly light my grandfather had described. And in that moment, I knew with terrible certainty that everything he had written was true. The burden had passed to me. I was the guardian now. And somewhere in the Ural Mountains, an ancient door was opening once again. My hands moved automatically, reaching for my grandfather's old leather bag in the corner of the study. I began gathering what I needed. The journal, the photographs, the pendant that now seemed to pulse in time with my racing heart. The temperature in the room had dropped so low that the air itself felt brittle, like it might shatter at any moment. I found the key exactly where his letter said it would be, behind the loose brick in the fireplace. It was made of the same strange metal as the pendant, and holding them close together made both objects vibrate slightly, as if recognizing each other. The drive to the bank was a blur. Every traffic light held a figure in the distance. Every store window showed reflections that shouldn't exist. Twice, I saw what looked like Igor Dyatlov walking parallel to my car, keeping perfect pace despite my increasing speed. But when I turned to look directly, there was only empty sidewalk. The safe deposit box contained exactly what my grandfather promised, and more. The map was unlike anything I'd ever seen, not drawn on paper but etched into a thin sheet of that same unidentifiable metal. The boundaries he mentioned formed a pattern across the Ural Mountains, centering on Dyatlov Pass but extending far beyond it. Certain points were marked with symbols that matched those on the pendant. There were documents too, lists of names, other guardians I assumed, though many had been crossed out. Recent dates next to the lines, too recent. At the bottom of the stack was a newspaper clipping from just 3 days ago. 3 experienced hikers missing in Ural Mountains. The article mentioned they were last seen near Dead Mountain. My phone rang, making me jump. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail, remembering my grandfather's warning. The message it left was 9 seconds of static, broken by what sounded like 9 voices speaking in unison. Among the documents was a letter from someone named Viktor Petrov, dated just a month ago. He claimed to be the grandson of the same Viktor who had warned my grandfather back in 1959. According to his letter, the old ceremonies that kept the boundaries strong were dying out. The last of the Mansi elders who knew the original rituals had passed away, taking their knowledge with them. The doors were growing unstable. But it was the photograph paperclip to Victor's letter that made my heart stop. It showed a familiar concrete structure in the mountains, its Soviet-era doors hanging open. The ancient symbols that had once sealed it were broken, and standing in the doorway was a figure in a modern hiking jacket, their face turned just enough to be visible. It was my grandfather. The photo was dated 2 days before his death. I knew then what I had to do. The coordinates on the map pointed to locations across the globe, places where the boundaries between worlds had grown thin, but they all connected back to one point, to where it all began, to Dead Mountain. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and booked a flight to Russia. As I completed the purchase, a reflection in the bank's window caught my eye. 9 figures standing in a semicircle behind me, their faces frozen in those terrible smiles. When I turned, there was only the empty bank lobby, but my breath fogged in the suddenly freezing air. The pendant grew warm against my chest, and for a moment, I heard my grandfather's voice as clearly as if he were standing beside me. The door must be watched, the truth must be preserved. I gathered the contents of the safe deposit box and headed for my car. Above me, the winter sky had grown dark with storm clouds, and small flakes of snow began to fall. They melted when they touched the ground, but the ones that landed on my skin left tiny, perfect circles of frost, like markers, like signals. They knew I was coming. As I drove home to pack, every radio station turned to static, then burst into a chorus of 9 voices speaking words that hurt my ears. Through my rearview mirror, I caught glimpses of figures walking on the rooftops of buildings, keeping pace with my car, their movements too smooth to be human. The game had begun again, but this time, I wasn't just following my grandfather's footsteps into mystery. I was following them into the dark. The flight to Russia was 16 hours of barely contained terror. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, the 9 hikers, standing in the airplane's narrow aisle, watching me with those fixed smiles. The pendant grew colder with each passing hour, and ice crystals formed on the inside of my window, even as other passengers complained about the heat. Somewhere over the Atlantic, the in-flight entertainment system on my screen flickered to life by itself. Instead of the usual movie selection, it showed grainy footage that looked decades old. 9 hikers setting up camp in the snow. The footage jumped and distorted, and suddenly they were running, their faces masks of terror. The screen went black, then displayed a single line of text in glowing green letters. "Welcome to the family, Guardian." When I asked the flight attendant about it, she saw only the regular entertainment menu, but as she walked away, her reflection in the darkened window turned and smiled at me while she continued forward. Viktor Petrov met me at the airport in Yekaterinburg. He was a weathered man in his 50s, with eyes that had seen too much and hands that wouldn't stop moving. The pendant reacted to his presence, growing warm for the first time since I'd found it. "You have your grandfather's look about you," he said in heavily accented English. "The same haunted eyes. They've been watching you already, haven't they?" I nodded, and he cursed softly in Russian. It's happening faster this time. The boundaries, they're like tissue paper now. Things are slipping through, dark things, old things. He glanced over his shoulder, then lowered his voice. 3 more hikers went missing yesterday. The authorities are keeping it quiet, but... He didn't need to finish. We both knew what it meant. The drive to the base of Dead Mountain took 4 hours through increasingly desolate countryside. Victor filled the time with stories, tales passed down through generations of his family about what really lived in these mountains, about doors that opened to places beyond human comprehension, about the people who had been chosen throughout history to stand guard against what waited on the other side. Your grandfather, Victor said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He was different from the other guardians. He got closer to the truth than anyone. That's why they never stopped watching him. Why they followed him even to America. What truth? I asked. Victor's eyes met mine in the rearview mirror. That they're not trying to get out, he whispered. They're trying to get back in. The road ended at a small village that felt frozen in time. Ancient wooden houses huddled together against the cold, their windows dark and unwelcoming. The few people visible on the streets hurried about their business, heads down, refusing to meet our eyes. They knew what we were, what we represented. We gathered our equipment in silence, climbing gear, cold weather supplies, and items Victor said we'd need for the old rituals. The pendant had begun to pulse more frequently now, its symbols casting moving shadows even in the bright afternoon sun. As we shouldered our packs, I noticed something odd about the village. There were no children playing in the streets, no dogs barking, no birds in the sky. The whole place felt held in a moment, like a photograph about to fade. They're all gone, Victor said, following my gaze. The animals sense it first, then the children. They know when the door is opening. We started up the trail that would lead us to Dead Mountain, to the place where 9 hikers had died running from something so terrible that freezing to death seemed like a better option, to the broken seal that my grandfather had died trying to repair. The snow began to fall harder as we climbed, but it wasn't natural. Each flake, when caught on my sleeve, contained tiny symbols that matched the ones on the pendant. The wind carried whispers in a language that made my head hurt. And behind us, barely visible in the growing storm, 9 sets of footprints appeared in the snow, following our path even though no one was there to make them. Victor touched my arm and pointed ahead. Through the swirling snow I could make out a dark shape. The concrete bunker from the photograph. Its metal doors hung open like a broken mouth, the ancient symbols that once sealed it now shattered and dark. But it was what stood in the doorway that made my blood freeze. A figure in a modern hiking jacket, exactly as they'd appeared in the photograph with my grandfather. Slowly, the figure turned toward us. It wore my grandfather's face, and it was smiling. Don't look directly at it, Victor hissed, grabbing my arm. That's not your grandfather. That's not anything that was ever human. The thing wearing my grandfather's face took a step forward. The snow around its feet turned black and seemed to curl away from its presence. When it spoke, its voice was my grandfather's, but wrong, like someone playing a recording backward and forward simultaneously. We've been waiting for you, it said, the words coming out in both English and that other language, the one that hurt to hear. Your grandfather understood, in the end. He saw the beauty of what lies beyond. Won't you come see it too? The pendant against my chest had grown so cold it burned. Its symbols were glowing brightly now, casting wild shadows that moved against the falling snow. Victor began chanting something under his breath, ancient words that made the air ripple. They're lying, a voice said behind us. I spun around to find an old woman standing there, her clothes decades out of date. I recognized her from my grandfather's photographs, the same woman who had given him the pendant in 1959. She hadn't aged a day. They always lie, that's how they get in. More figures were emerging from the snow, people I recognized from my grandfather's journal, the missing hikers from the recent newspaper article, villagers who had vanished over the decades, all wearing those terrible smiles, all standing too still to be alive. The door, Victor said urgently. We have to reach the door. The real door, not that thing they want us to see. He pointed past the bunker to where the swirling snow seemed to part around a space that my eyes couldn't quite focus on. The thing wearing my grandfather's face laughed, and the sound was echoed by every figure around us. "You can't close what was never meant to be closed," they said in unison. "We are the answer to every question humanity has ever asked. We are what waits behind every door you've ever feared to open." I clutched the pendant tightly, and suddenly I could see what my grandfather had seen in that final photograph from his journal. Behind the smiling figures, reality itself seemed to bend and warp. The snow wasn't falling, it was flowing upward toward a point in space that seemed to swallow light itself. "Your grandfather tried to warn them," the old woman said, her voice carrying clearly despite the howling wind. "In 1959, 9 hikers came too close to the truth. We had to act. But your grandfather, he was special. He could see us as we really are, just like you can." "What are you?" I managed to ask. The thing wearing my grandfather's face took another step forward. The air around it rippled like heat waves, and for a moment, I caught a glimpse of its true form. My mind recoiled from what I saw, refusing to process shapes and angles that couldn't exist in our reality. "We are the Watchers," it said. "The guardians of doors your kind was never meant to find. For millennia we kept the balance, but your people, your clever, curious people, you built your machines and your theories. You started to see the cracks in reality, started to peek behind doors that were sealed for a reason." "The military base," Victor said. "The Soviet experiments." The thing nodded, its smile growing impossibly wide. "They thought they could control it. Control us. They broke the seals, shattered boundaries that had stood since the dawn of time, and now..." It spread its arms and the snow stopped falling entirely, hanging suspended in the air like stars. "Now the doors are open, the boundaries are failing, and we can finally come home." The pendant pulsed once, violently, and suddenly I understood. I saw what my grandfather had discovered, why he had spent decades running, why he had chosen me to continue his work. The Watchers weren't trying to break through into our world. They were already here, and we were the ones who needed to escape. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The pendant's glow had spread, forming a protective circle around Victor and me. Outside that circle, the smiling figures watched us with hungry anticipation. "The bunker was never a way in," I said, the words tumbling out as understanding dawned. "It was a way out. The hikers in 1959, they weren't running away from something. They were running towards something, trying to reach the real door before we could stop them." The thing wearing my grandfather's face finished. Its features were shifting now, melting and reforming like wax under flame. But they were too slow, just like all the others, just like your grandfather. Victor's chanting had grown louder, and I could feel power building in the air around us. The ancient words seemed to catch the light from the pendant, forming glowing symbols that hung in the freezing air. "Your grandfather almost succeeded," the old woman said, but her voice had changed, becoming deeper, older. Her form flickered like bad reception on an old television. "He found the truth in these mountains, found the way back to your reality, but he made one mistake. He came back for me," I whispered, remembering the last entry in his journal. "He could have escaped, but he came back to warn me." The thing that was no longer pretending to be my grandfather nodded, its face now a shifting mass of features I recognized from old photographs. Igor Dyatlov, the other hikers, countless missing persons who had vanished in these mountains over the decades. "Such a human thing to do," it said, almost fondly, "sacrificing freedom for love. But he did succeed in one thing. He prepared you, taught you, through his journal, through his warnings. You can see us as we truly are." The snow began to move again, but now I could see it for what it really was. Fragments of reality itself, breaking down as the boundaries between worlds continued to dissolve. The figures around us were moving closer, their smiles growing wider, their forms becoming less and less human. "The pendant," Victor gasped, his voice strained from the effort of his chanting. "It's not just protection, it's a key. Your grandfather encoded the truth in its symbols. The same symbols the Soviets found in this mountain. The same symbols they tried to replicate in their experiments." I lifted the pendant, and its light seemed to catch on invisible seams in the air, illuminating hairline fractures in reality itself. Through those cracks, I caught glimpses of somewhere else. Somewhere real, our world. The world we'd been taken from so gradually, so perfectly, that humanity hadn't even noticed the substitution. How long? I asked, my voice shaking. How long have we been here? How long have you been replacing things? The chorus of voices that answered seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Since the first human looked up at the stars and wondered what lay beyond. Since the first dream of something greater than your tiny reality, we are the answer to every prayer for something more, something greater, something beyond the mundane world you thought you knew. The thing that had been my grandfather reached for us, its arm stretching impossibly long. Stay with us, it said, its voice a symphony of every missing person who had ever vanished in these mountains. Accept the beauty of our world. Accept the smiles. Accept the eternal dance of forms and faces. But I could see the truth now. Behind their smiles lurked something ancient and hungry, something that had been consuming our reality piece by piece, person by person, replacing everything with its own twisted versions. The hikers had discovered this truth. My grandfather had discovered it, and now... Victor, I said, gripping the pendant tightly, the ritual, it's not for closing their door, is it? He shook his head, still chanting between words. It's for opening ours. The real door, the way back. The pendant's light had become blinding, cutting through the swirling chaos around us to illuminate a simple wooden door standing in the snow. A door that had no business being there, a door that looked exactly like the one from my grandfather's study. They're not trapped here, I realized. We are. We're seeing their world overlaid on ours, seeing how they've been changing things, replacing things. The door is home, Victor finished. But we have to hurry. The boundaries are almost gone. Soon there won't be enough of our reality left to go back to. The air itself seemed to bend and twist around us as we ran toward the door. The smiling figures converged from all sides, their forms shifting and stretching in impossible ways. The snow beneath our feet had turned black, and each step felt like running through deep water. Your grandfather understood sacrifice. The chorus of voices called after us. He understood the price of knowledge. Are you prepared to pay what he paid? The pendant burned against my chest as we reached the door. Up close, I could see that the wood was covered in the same symbols that marked the pendant. But these were moving, flowing like liquid metal across the surface. Victor's chanting had reached a fever pitch, and blood trickled from his nose with the effort of maintaining the ritual. It's not that simple, the thing that had been the old woman said, suddenly standing between us and the door. You cannot simply leave. There must be balance. There must be replacement. Understanding hit me like a physical blow. I looked at Victor and I knew he had already realized it too. The door would open, but only one of us could go through. The other would have to stay, would have to take their place among the smiling watchers, becoming another face for them to wear. Your grandfather made his choice, the voices whispered. He chose to stay, to become part of us, so that you might have this chance. But you must choose too. Who stays? Who goes? Victor's chanting never stopped, but his eyes met mine. In them, I saw decades of knowledge, of guarding ancient secrets. He nodded once, and I knew what I had to do. I'm sorry, I whispered. The pendant's light flared blindingly bright as I pressed it into Victor's hand. His eyes widened in surprise, but before he could react, I shoved him toward the door. It swung open at his touch, revealing a glimpse of something pure and real. Our world, untainted by the Watcher's influence. No, he screamed, reaching for me, but the door was already closing behind him. I turned to face the Watchers, feeling their reality beginning to seep into me. The smiles didn't seem so terrible now. The impossible angles of their forms began to make a strange sort of sense. Like grandfather, like grandchild, they said, their voices becoming my voice, a guardian to the end. But as their world began to consume me, as I felt my own smile beginning to stretch too wide, I touched the small metal object I had palmed from Victor's pocket during our run to the door, not the pendant. That had been a decoy necessary to power his escape. This was something else, something my grandfather had hidden in the safe deposit box, something even the Watchers didn't know about. A key, not to open the door, but to destroy it. As my humanity began to fade, as their reality began to write itself into my DNA, I lifted the key. The Watchers realized too late what it meant. What my grandfather had really discovered in his decades of research. Why he had really stayed behind. You can't close a door that was never meant to be closed, but you can shatter it completely. I turned the key in empty air, and reality began to scream. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The smiling figures recoiled as one, their forms twisting in panic. The key in my hand grew hot, then cold, then disappeared entirely, but its work was already done. Cracks appeared in the air itself, spreading like ice breaking on a frozen lake. Through them, I could see fragments of other places, other times, all the pieces of reality they had stolen and replaced over the centuries. "What have you done?" they howled, their voices a cacophony of terror. The boundaries, they're not just breaking, they're shattering. The ground beneath my feet began to splinter, revealing not earth or rock, but layers upon layers of stolen moments, captured memories, replaced realities. The Watcher's world wasn't just overlaid on ours. It was built from pieces of thousands of realities, all stacked and interwoven like a vast, impossible tapestry. And now that tapestry was unraveling. Your grandfather knew, the thing that had worn his face said, its features dissolving into a kaleidoscope of borrowed faces. He found the original boundary, the first door. He knew destroying it would. Its words were lost as reality continued to fracture. The swirling snow had turned into fragments of pure light, each flake containing reflections of different worlds, different possibilities. I saw glimpses of what might have been, the 9 hikers making it safely down the mountain, my grandfather growing old in peace, a world where the Watchers had never found their way in. The smiling figures were coming apart now, their carefully maintained forms breaking down into streams of pure energy. As their disguises fell away, I finally saw them for what they truly were. Not monsters, not demons, but something far stranger. They were like holes in reality itself, spaces where something had been removed and replaced with a poor copy. And as the key's power continued to spread, those holes were being filled again. The process was beautiful and terrible to watch. Every broken piece of reality was finding its way home, slotting back into place like a vast puzzle reassembling itself. The Watchers screamed as their stolen faces were torn away, as the memories and moments they had consumed were ripped from their grasp. I felt it happening to me too. The Watcher essence that had begun to seep into my being was being burned away, replaced by pure, untainted humanity. It hurt, God, it hurt. But it was a clean pain, like alcohol on a wound. Through the chaos, I caught a final glimpse of my grandfather's true face. Not the Watcher's copy, but a memory of him as he had really been. He was smiling, but it was a real smile, warm and proud and human. In that moment, I understood why he had stayed behind, why he had spent decades planning this moment. Sometimes the only way to fix something broken is to break it completely and start again. The world around me was coming apart faster now, the false reality crumbling like sand in a windstorm. But beneath it, through the cracks, I could see something else emerging, something real, the true Dyatlov Pass, untainted by the Watcher's influence, the mountain as it was meant to be. The last thing I heard before consciousness faded was the sound of 9 voices, not the Watchers this time, but the original hikers, their souls finally free from the Watcher's grasp, raised in a cry of triumph and release. Then everything went white. I woke up in a hospital in Yekaterinburg. Victor was there, holding my hand. He looked older somehow, more worn, but his eyes were clear, and his smile, his wonderfully human smile, was genuine. "You did it," he said simply. "The boundaries are restored. The Watchers, they're gone. Really gone." "How long?" I asked, my throat dry. 3 days, he replied. "The authorities found us in the snow near Dead Mountain. They're saying it was an avalanche, a freak storm. They don't remember anything else. No one does, except the Guardians." I finished. He nodded. "Those of us who knew, who saw the truth, we remember. Someone has to keep watching, even now, just in case." I looked out the hospital window at the mountain in the distance. For a moment, I thought I saw 9 figures standing in the snow, their faces peaceful now, no longer frozen in those terrible smiles. Then they faded like mist in morning sun, finally at rest. In my hand, I found my grandfather's pendant. The symbols no longer moved, no longer glowed. They were just markings now, a reminder of what had been, what had almost been. The door was closed, the boundaries were healed, the watchers were gone. But sometimes, on cold nights when the snow falls thick and heavy, I find myself checking mirrors, watching for smiles that stretch too wide. And I keep the pendant close, its weight a constant reminder. Because someone has to remember, someone has to know the truth about what really happened at Dyatlov Pass. Someone has to keep watching the doors that shouldn't exist, even the ones that are safely closed. After all, that's what guardians do.